Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Patrice Schell, a member of the League of Women Voters of the Uncompahgre Valley. I'm joined today by Carol Howe, our Vice President, who will be managing the technology and keeping us within our time limit. Our League adheres to the principles of the National League to be a nonpartisan organization which encourages informed and active participation in government through education and advocacy. Our League does work on behalf of Delta, Montrose, and Ouray counties, and just as a reminder, we do not support or oppose political parties or candidates. Thank you for joining us to learn about redistricting. It's an honor to have two of the commissioners with us tonight. Lori Schell, no relation to me, is unaffiliated and represents Colorado District 3. She worked on the congressional maps. We also have Robin Shepard. She's a Democrat, also representing Colorado District 3, and she worked on the legislative side. They will present their experience and perspective with a focus on the impact of redistricting in Delta, Montrose, and Ouray counties. And by the way, if you want to see the full bio of our presenters and the bios of all the commissioners, that can be found on the Colorado Redistricting website. A few housekeeping notes before we start. The commissioners are with us for an hour, so we have a lot of ground to cover. Attendees right now have only view access to the webinar. Questions can be submitted through the Q&A function in Zoom. Please address questions to the appropriate commissioner. And if you have any problems getting into that Q&A function, you can, I believe, submit a question through the chat. Please keep in mind that due to time constraints, not all questions can be answered. All right, I'm going to do a brief timeline of the Colorado districting, how we got here. It's sort of a origin story. In 2018, the League of Women Voters of Colorado worked with the advocacy community to pass amendments Y and Z to the state constitution. These amendments established the Colorado Independent Congressional and Legislative Redistricting Commissions. There are 6 commissioners on the Congressional Commission, made up of 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 2 unaffiliated voters. The Legislative Commission is made up of 12 commissioners, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 4 unaffiliated voters. I'm going to be repeating this quite often, but there are multiple sources for you to view the inception and the early days of the 2021 Colorado redistricting. Since the plans have already been submitted to the Colorado Supreme Court, our panelists will report on the present. But first, let me report on what's happened in the last few weeks and months. It's sort of a here's where we are now. Public testimony on congressional and legislative maps started in July, continued in August and September, and into early October. The Congressional Commission, if I have my dates right, approved their final map on September 29th. It was submitted to the Supreme Court on the Colorado Supreme Court on October 1st. Oral arguments before the court start on October 12th. The Legislative Commission recently completed their work on October 11th. They are required to submit their map to the Supreme Court by October 15th. Again, for you policy wonks, I encourage you to visit the redistrictingcolorado.gov to review the process, listen to public hearing, testimony, view maps, documents, and obtain other information. Let's get started with Commissioner Shepard, who will talk about the legislative redistricting, which was recently completed. And take it away, Commissioner Shepard.
Thanks. Can you see the screen? Great, thank you. Well, so great to be with all of you. I love the League of Women Voters and everything that you've done. And so I'm going to go briefly through this because Commissioner Schell and I really want to get to questions. So what is redistricting? You probably all know what it is, but every 10 years after there's a census, we have to draw the lines. And Colorado gained 1 seat because Colorado has gotten a boost in population, so it's getting 1 congressional seat. But on the legislative side, it stays of 65 House seats and 35 Senate seats. So that is what we do every 10 years. And who does the redistricting? Usually in the past, it was done by the legislature, but was mentioned before, there was an amendment that was passed, Y and Z. Y was congressional, Z was legislative, to establish an independent commission. So it's the first time, we are the first time inaugural commissioners to do this process, and each commission has 12 members, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 4 unaffiliated. And we had nonpartisan legislative staff that worked with us on both commissions. So this is the map of, you can see, if you can see my cursor, Commissioner Schell there from Durango. Those are all the people that were on the Congressional Commission. And then for us in the legislative, I'm up in Steamboat Springs, so also in Congressional District 3, just kind of in the polar opposites of Ouray. And I don't know if you have snow. I've had snow the last couple of days. You have that's kind of where we're from. And what's helpful is that the commissioners bring that subject matter expertise from these different areas. So what I'm going to stay a little bit on this slide because this is really important. There is a hierarchy of required criteria of making decisions for the maps. And so there's a population in the congressional, they can only deviate between, I think it's 1 person from the different districts in the congressional districts. Legislative, we have a little bit more wiggle room. It's not more than 5% between the 2 districts, so 2.5 and 2.5, but population is key. Then the other one is complying with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to make sure there's no minority dilution, making sure that minorities are able to elect candidates of their choice. And then contiguous, so that they are next to each other and then we don't have the famous North Carolina kind of salamander looking maps. Then the next row is preserving whole communities of interest. That's a COI. And that's why we went and had over 30 meetings around the state to hear from people about their communities of interest. So that was a really important thing to hear. And communities of interest can be anything from policy, urban, rural, agriculture, education, employment. Then there's preserving whole political subdivisions. That means, like, is it a city, is it a town, or a county? It's easier to preserve counties in the rural areas, like so on the Western Slope and the Eastern Plains. In the Front Range, sometimes counties have to be split because of population. And then keeping districts compact. And then if you've satisfied all of that, then you can maintain competitive districts. And competitive means that in the Constitution, it says that that seat could change in a 10-year time period. So I talked a little bit of communities' interests. You can read this list. So that's just all these different things. So for where I am in Steamboat Springs, we had a lot of communities of interest of rural agriculture, resort towns, those kind of issues. On the Front Range, you might have different things. And then there's issues like affordable housing, things that federal legislators or state legislators can work on. And because really, we talk about redistricting and we talk about the politicians, but really the most important thing is to think about these are the people that make the policy. So whether it's on the federal or the state level. So whoever we elect are the ones that are working for to have policy that impacts us. So I am tired because we just finished our maps, and I have to say for the last week up until Tuesday, we had a meeting every single day. So we decided on our house map just this past Monday at 11:30 at night after meeting for I don't know how many hours. It was really long time. So that was our final approved state map. So you guys are going to be House District 58. And as you know, a lot in the, again, the Western Slope and the Eastern Plains, those House districts are so big because population is dispersed. And then on the Senate map, we just decided that on Tuesday, and was mentioned earlier, then these maps, the nonpartisan staff, made sure that these maps complied with all the criteria. We also did, we hired a voting rights act analysis, an analyst, sorry, Dr. Hanley, and she came up with criteria. And it's a little challenging in Colorado because we haven't had a statewide minority candidate to get all the data, but there are certain areas in the state where you have high minority representation. So we are making sure that we compiled with the Voting Rights Act. So these final approved maps, we voted on them, the last one in the Senate on Tuesday, this past Tuesday, and they go to the Supreme Court on Friday. And so, and then we did something called an ensemble analysis. So we hired these two professors, one from CU and the other one from Colorado College, that have come up with this computer program that takes a lot of criteria to see whether it's partisan towards Democrat or Republican. And this is, you see these lines, third staff plan, the number of competitive districts. You can see on these, the names are the different commissioners that had proposed these maps. So this can take a lot of information together, like contiguousness, compactness. But as the two academics said, the challenge that they have is when you do create an ensemble analysis, you cannot take communities of interest into account. And so, I've often been asked, why don't you just do computers for congressional, or the lines for the state or house or congressional. And we have something called geography in this state. So sometimes a line is in a different place because there's a mountain or a river or something like that. And then the other thing is communities of interest, and especially on the Front Range with gentrification. Not everybody lives in a city boundary, but you may have a community that has an interest together. So this was an interesting data point, the ensemble analysis, but from my perspective and a lot of other commissioners, it was not able to include communities of interest. So that became a little challenging. So I'm going to now, I can just keep doing the maps. You tell me when to go to Commissioner Shell to talk about congressional. You're muted.
Thank you, Robin. So I am going to just quickly run through the logistics of how we on the congressional side got to a final map. And this is a little bit easier to see with only 8 districts than with 35 or 65. So the process was similar on the legislative side, but again, it's much easier to illustrate on the congressional side. So I'll just do kind of an evolution of the plans. So the preliminary plan on the right-hand side here was the first map drawn by the nonpartisan staff, and we gave them license to move forward with a preliminary plan using preliminary data because of the delay in the release of the census data. Had we waited for the final census data, it would have been impossible for us to have met our mandate. So on the left-hand side, you can see what the existing 7 districts look like from the 2011 redistricting. Then again, on the right-hand side is the preliminary plan that was drawn by nonpartisan staff in June. And the purple district, you can see where the arrow is pointing, was where the new 8th congressional district was placed. And it was really placed north of Denver in the high growth zone along Highway 85, 285, excuse me. So if we move to the next slide, the preliminary plan will be now on the left-hand side. So that was the one on the right-hand side. Moved from the preliminary plan on the left to the first staff plan on the right. Now, this was the first map that was drawn using actual 2020 census data. And you can see the fundamental difference between the two maps is the map on the left, the preliminary plan, maintains the kind of east-west split of the state, whereas the first staff plan is a more north-south split of the larger geographic districts. And these were really the two competing lines of thinking throughout the whole process of congressional redistricting. And it was based on a definition of various communities of interest, rural, educational, transportation, ski areas, Hispanic focused districts based on historic cultural ties. So if we go to the next map, the first staff plan now shifts to the left, just for a point of reference. And you can see the second staff plan is quite different from the first staff plan. It goes to more of an east-west split. And you can see that the western slope is predominantly kept whole, except for the green Congressional District 2, the north central district. And that puts places like Steamboat Springs, like Vail, and Vail, and some of the other Beaver Creek, puts them in a more front range facing district. We heard a lot about all of their tourists typically come from the Denver airport, and they wanted to be more front range facing. So we had a little bit of a difference there. And then a lot of people on the western slope who wanted to have the western slope kept whole or not, if you were proponents of that southern district. Kind of have the heart of Colorado Central District, which is kind of the front range, but kind of intermountain district. El Paso County there in gray. El Paso County itself has too much population to be a single congressional district, so part of it had to be calved off. And in different, you can see in these two maps, more of it was split off in the first staff plan on the left than it was on the second staff plan to the right. But throughout the whole process, that new 8th Congressional District kept its basic location north of Denver. So if we go to the next slide, the second staff plan will slide to the left, and the third staff plan, which was fundamentally based on the second staff plan, is on the right. And the importance of the third staff plan was that that was the last staff plan. And if the commission, and this applies to either commission, if the commission was unable to approve by a supermajority vote, that was 8 commissioners, including 2 unaffiliated commissioners, then the third staff plan, unamended, would be the one that went to the Supreme Court for approval. So how the third staff plan looked was very, very important. And you can see it's very similar to the second staff plan. You can see that there's a bigger chunk taken out of southwest Eagle County. That was to keep the Roaring Fork Valley community of interest whole, as well as to balance population. I believe that in CD3, Eagle County was the only county that was split. And then you can see there's some changes in the kind of heart of Colorado, the Brown District, CD7 in the middle. And there's some changes in the shape of CD8, new congressional district. One of the big points of debate among the commission was what was a proper location for Greeley. Did Greeley belong in the 8th Congressional District because of the growth and the influx of kind of affordable, more affordable housing, more Hispanic workers, or was it a more natural fit for Congressional District 4 on the Eastern Plains? So if we go to the next slide, we'll see the third staff plan, and then well, actually, we won't see the third staff plan. This is the map that was approved on the left, and you can see it looked very much like the third staff plan. CD8 is now in brown. So where we ended up was that Greeley ended up in the new Congressional District 8, and to get the population that we needed for the Eastern Plains District, all of Douglas County, except for the bit of Aurora that's in Douglas County, is included in the Eastern Plains District CD4. At the end, the very last night of our decision making, well, this week, we're still pretty well divided on whether or not the map on the left, which is somewhat more traditional east-west split, was how we were going to go, or whether this idea of a southern district was going to prevail. The Schuster map is the one on the right. This was submitted in public comments by a man whose last name was Schuster. And we kind of toggled back and forth through 7 rounds of voting. And in the end, the map on the left was the one that we approved as the final approved map. The concept of a southern district was part of the discussion, very importantly, through to the very end. So if we go to the next slide, we also, the Ensemble Analysis folks did a more general ensemble analysis for the congressional side of the House. What they do is basically, in this case, they ran 200,000 kind of randomly generated maps, and the only criteria that they used in generating these maps were the very basic redistricting criteria that Commissioner Shepard talked about early on. And so you can see the only difference between these is how wide the vote band was. In other words, how much the partisan lean was, allowed partisan lean would be. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner, if we had an 11.5% band that was acceptable, then the most commonly expected number of competitive districts in Colorado would be 2, with 3 or 4 or even 1 or 5 being extreme outliers. As you tighten that allowed vote band, moving to the right, upper right to 10%, you can see that 2 becomes, much stronger and 1 becomes much stronger. So we're kind of moving to fewer and fewer competitive districts. If you tighten that vote band to 8.5, then you can see 1 on the bottom center. You can see that the expectation out of these 200,000 maps, majority of them, 40-some% of them, had just 1 competitive district. So you can see as you tighten the vote band, you make it harder and harder to achieve competitive districts. And so if, as you tighten that vote band, that number of competitive districts would shift further and further to the left. So one of the issues with the Schuster map that we saw on the previous slide was that it had 3 districts that had a vote band of under 3%. So that's 3 competitive districts under 3%. So if we had tightened this analysis to under 3%, that the expectation would have been for fewer and fewer competitive districts. So there were some concerns that having 3 competitive districts under 3% is not a result that perhaps would be reasonably expected. So it was kind of an interesting, this ensemble analysis played a very important role, I'd say, both on the congressional side and on the legislative side. And the legislative commission actually hired them to do more specific analyses. So going to the next slide is kind of the where we are and where we're headed at this point. We've been active on the congressional side since the middle of March and on the legislative side since the 1st of April. So we're now at the point where on the congressional side, we approved our map on the 28th of September and it was submitted on the 1st of October. Meanwhile, the legislative is going, they were 2 weeks behind us. They were 2 weeks behind us being seated, and everything they do is 2 weeks on a 2-week delay from where the congressional was. So while they're approving their plans and submitting it to the Supreme Court on the 15th, on the 12th, we actually in congressional were having oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court, which I will address in the next slide. So on the congressional side, we have the 1st of November is being our deadline for either approval or to kick the map back to us by the Supreme Court. And again, on the 2-week delay, that deadline for the legislative side is on the 15th of November. So the last slide, it just will lay out a little bit of where we are. This is specific to the congressional side. As I mentioned, on the 12th, on Tuesday, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on the congressional final approved map. That was approved by our commission on an 11-to-1 vote. You can see here there were 14 parties who filed briefs. Not all of them took part in the oral arguments, but quite a number of them did. So that was 13 parties in addition to the commission itself. One of the major points of contention was whether or not the Congressional Commission had adequately avoided dilution of minority votes. That was with the large congressional districts that we have in Colorado and the kind of disparity in population density around the state. It was our understanding that it would be almost impossible for us to create a majority minority district, but there was a debate as to whether or not you had to make influence districts or what they call crossover districts. So a lot of the briefs that were filed addressed that issue, and that really was kind of two competing thoughts on that. One is the Voting Rights Act of 1965 as amended, and whether or not that requires creation of majority, minority, or influence districts, and the other being the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution about equal representation. So I won't pretend to understand all of the legal arguments there, but several of these, four or five of these interveners are organizations that put forward Hispanic-dominated maps as their major community of interest. And the criticism was that the Congressional Commission perhaps didn't focus enough on Hispanic communities of interest. We, of course, had a whole state to redistrict and many communities of interest. Those are somewhat represented here by Eagle County, who was unhappy because we took that bite out of their southwest corner to the Roaring Fork Valley whole. Douglas County Board of County Commissioners came in and said, thank you very much for keeping us whole. The city of Denver had an issue with a precinct that only was going to have 19 people in it. So there were Jefferson County here towards the bottom, Jerry Natividad was unhappy because Jefferson County got split between three different congressional districts for a number of reasons. Again, Summit County and Breckenridge were happy that they were in that congressional district too, more front range facing. William Tebow on the bottom had a map that he had submitted that he believes better reflects the communities of interest and all of the other criteria than our map. So the oral arguments were heard on Tuesday. Again, the only reason that the Supreme Court, the Colorado Supreme Court, can remand or kick the map back to our commission or to the Legislative Commission if it determines that the commission abused its discretion with respect to any of the redistricting requirements. So that has to be done for the Congressional Commission by the 1st of November or for the Legislative Commission by the 15th of November. In either case, the affected commission would have 12 days to cure the issues. That's a legal term, but basically to take what they say we did wrong and figure out how to fix it. And that would include having additional public testimony and a public hearing. And then if that's the case, then they would have until the 15th of December to approve our revised congressional map, or again, till the end of December to approve a revised legislative map. So that's kind of where we are. One of the interesting things about the oral arguments from the congressional side that took place on Tuesday was that a number of the interveners had conflicting criticisms of the congressional map. So the court was a little bit, well, you say X and this other party said Y. What are we supposed to do with that as a court? So that was kind of interesting. And even with respect to whether the districts, had done a voter dilution or not. Some people really liked the districts. Other people said, you didn't have focus enough on minority voting dilution. So it'll be very interesting to see what the court does and what their rationale may be for either approving or remanding the maps back to either one of the commissions.
Thank you. We've got plenty of time now for questions, and Carol will be the arbiter of the questions and get those to the appropriate commissioner.
You may have noticed we only have one attendee, and I think I will allow them to talk. Sure. To allow them to ask their questions directly, and I'm going to promote them as panelists. I'm not quite sure what happened, why we didn't have the people we anticipated. But we are recording, and you've provided a lot of very good information, and hopefully between all of us who are on this panel, we can now answer questions that will add additional value to this, because I learned a lot. I have some questions. So I'll start out with one. This one is for Commissioner Shepard. We did get a few questions coming in at the beginning or prior to the session. This is, I watched one of the meetings where several legislative district maps were proposed and voted on. I noticed some maps were amended or created by a small coalition of commissioners. That seemed to give their proposals the votes needed to move their map out of committee. Were the other commissioners invited to participate?
That was the question?
Yes.
Well, that's a contentious part because so what we had on our commission, I'll just be very blunt. We had I would say voting blocks. So you had the 4 Republicans that voted together. You had one Democrat, Commissioner Horvath, that voted with the Republicans all the time, 3 Democrats, and then 2 independents that voted with the Democrats. So we had a 5-7 split on a regular basis. Any commissioner can submit any map. So that I would call the conservative caucus side of the House there of the commission decided to create extra meetings to do map meetings. So there were not personal invitations. I got an email from one of the commissioners to if I had any suggestions for one of the Senate maps. But I think a number of us, myself, Commissioner Barry, Commissioner O'Leary, and Commissioner McReynolds, who has had a long time working on this, we felt it was outside of the scope of this process of Amendment Z, and that if we were going to do any map making, that we should do that in our meetings with all 12 commissioners, because everybody has subject matter expertise, and that was the process. So that was part of the challenge of, if you're going to have a meeting about a map, you have to have a public meeting, and they decided they wanted to do that, which is, everybody has that right. But I felt that wing of the House was way more interested in competitiveness than communities of interest. And so we had a difference in opinion, and I did not want to validate that process. So yes, got one email, not on the House maps, but on the Senate maps. But with the amount of meetings we have, I wanted to do the map making in the official meetings that we had, and not extra meetings. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, I think so. Well, you have sort of answered this. Did the makeup of the commissions and the way the commissioners work together turn out to be nonpartisan as intended? It sounds like there were some issues with definitely the legislative. What about on the congressional side?
I think the partisan divide on the congressional side was not as evident as it was, Robin, is that fair, as it was on the legislative side. There were some, I would say there was some evidence of partisan preferences, but I think it was less pronounced by far on the congressional side. I'm not sure if, I think the voting was much more fluid, which way the unaffiliated voted. I don't, there was maybe a preference generally toward one side or another, but I don't think it was as consistent perhaps as it was on the legislative side. That would be, I think, my observation from the congressional side. Robin, you think that's a fair?
Yeah,
statement?
probably fair. Yeah, but I would say is that, for regular people in the public, when you're thinking about, partisanship, you might have a D or an R after your name or an I. But a lot of it for us was not just what party you're from, it's just kind of what were your priorities. Mm-hmm. So I would say that on our commission that the Republicans' priority was competitiveness. And our priority was community of interest for a lot of the Democrats. So do you call that partisan? I don't think that's partisan. That's it's just kind of what you're prioritizing. So that is part of it. And the Constitution lays out what each of those areas are that I was explaining earlier in the presentation. But when you get down to it, like deciding what is the formula for competitiveness, or what is the formula for, like I know from my part of the world, we went to a meeting, we had meetings, I requested meetings in Steamboat Springs and Craig that are it's only 40 minutes apart, but it's like two different worlds and have very conflicting policy decisions. So that's always a challenge, especially I would say in congressional, that has to make these huge swaths of land together where you have, like I would say in my area where we have a resort town and a ski area that relies on snow. I mean, everybody relies on snow because of water. But there is a desire, I would say, in Steamboat and parts of Routt County to really address climate change. And then other, in Moffat County and Rio Blanco that has a high extractive industry, feel like any action on climate action is going to hurt the fracking industry or the coal industry. So it becomes very hard for any legislator that's trying to represent those areas. So I would say it's not just necessarily partisan, it's more kind of the different constitutional criteria in that process.
Yeah, and I would say to that point, I mentioned on the congressional side, there were, kind of two competing thoughts on whether the state should be split more along the east, along the continental divide, more east-west, or that southern district. And from once the southern district was really introduced as a resident of Southwest Colorado, I did not see the connection between Southwest Colorado and Southeast Colorado. I did not think that was a community of interest, and that, and that for me was completely nonpartisan. It was just I live in Southwest Colorado, and, I'm guessing most people in Southwest Colorado have never been to Lamar, for instance, and many people in Lamar, so that did not resonate with me as a community of interest. So I was very strongly opposed to the Southern District throughout the whole process, because I did not believe that it constituted a true community of interest. So, and I mentioned Greeley, that became a real point of contention in whether Greeley should be population center for CD8 or whether it should be a population center for CD4. Was it still more agricultural, or was it less agricultural? And if we didn't have Greeley in Congressional District 4, where were we going to get the population for that? And so we ended up having Douglas County be a population center for Congressional District 4. And a lot of those northern suburbs of Douglas County are very suburban. So, you know, the problem with Colorado and the density of the wildly disparate density, particularly from a congressional viewpoint, is that you have to put populated areas with less populated areas, because you have to have, you know, the number one criteria is the population balance. Particularly, I mean, we were plus or minus one person from our, you know, our ideal district.
Okay, thank you. Our attendees have submitted a question. How does the congressional mapping create issues for candidates that have already started competing for the 2022 election, especially in the 3rd district?
I can start. Or you go ahead.
Well, this was congressional, but so I don't know where anybody, well, I know where our representative lives because I'm in CD3, but I don't know where anybody else's live. And frankly, that played no role whatsoever in the redistricting process. Who was in their district, out of their district, who had declared candidacy or anything else. And I understand, you know, kind of after the fact, that there was a candidate who was going to run in CD3 who is now in CD2, I believe. So, but that played no role whatsoever in our redistricting decisions at the congressional level.
Did candidates for the upcoming election play any role in the legislative mapping?
No, they're not allowed to. So political incumbents are not allowed to, but I'll address this from another angle, is that, you know, political incumbents and where they lived are not allowed to play a role in the congressional maps or the legislative map. That's in the Constitution. What we did have in our House and Senate seats is, if you've read any of the articles where we have double incumbents, so the lines have drawn. So if you think about CD3, for example, Bob Rankin lives in Carbondale. We had a legislative priority to keep the Roaring Fork whole. So it actually goes from that little corner of Carbondale and then goes all the way, well, it doesn't go all the way to Parachute, but has Rifle and Silt, and then down to Aspen in that area, and it takes a little bit of Eagle. So that is probably more a Democratic leaning district, or at least from the House side, but he's a Republican legislator and he lives in Carbondale. So his term doesn't end because he's senator until 2024. So for us, we had this challenge of incumbents can't be part of this, but some senators are going to be in the same district. For the House, it doesn't matter because it's every 2 years. But for senators, if they want to run in the area, the lines may be different. You know, they're going to have to move, because in congressional, you don't have to live in your congressional district. In the House and Senate, you do. But I'll just add to it, just in the question that was in the chat, which is a little bit different. Did it impact redistricting? It's more about creating issues for the candidates. I've worked on a lot of political campaigns, and so a big part is, you want to announce early to let people know who your name is and start going to events, starting to raise money, knocking on doors. And if you don't know, whether it's congressional, House, or Senate, what your district looks like, then I think it gets really hard for any candidates to announce, because they don't know what the lines are going to be. So for anybody who's asked me, like, well, what's it going to be? And I'm like, well, until the Supreme Court certifies it, we have no idea. So if you want to run for office, wait till January 1st, because you're not going to know.
Right. And I would make 2 points in response to that. One is with respect to communities of interest. So both congressional and legislative defined the Roaring Fork Valley as a community of interest. However, Robin, correct me if I'm wrong, well, I'll just say from the congressional side, we included the Roaring Fork Valley to the Roaring Fork confluence with the Colorado at Glenwood Springs. We did not go downstream on the Colorado River. And legislative took it further down the river, as it were. And the other thing I would note with respect to the congressional redistricting, again, being from the Western Slope, we had to calve off some of the Western Slope because we had a 7-4 vote with one person was absent, 7-4 vote to keep 11 of the southern counties together. And that included into Huerfano and Las Animas, which again, I would consider those Eastern Plains counties, but there was a 7-4 vote so that was a recommendation rather than a requirement that said we needed to keep those 11 counties together. Because of that, if we wanted to keep the predominant part of the Western Slope whole, we were going to have to shed some of the population. And that's in part how that North Central District, CD2, got kind of moved to be more front range facing. I mean, that I think was the preference of at least some, if not most of the people that we heard from in those counties, because of the population requirements, and again, being much tighter on congressional, because of that need to keep those 11 southern counties together, we were going to have to break the Western Slope apart somewhere. And so that was, I think, why that CD2 and the candidate that was hoping to be running in CD3, that was part of the genesis of why that split happened.
So related to that, how were incarcerated populations where were they identified? Where were they counted? Were they counted where they're incarcerated, or were they counted where their last known residency was?
One for the on the congressional side, we counted them where they were counted. On the legislative side, they voted to move them back to their last home address. So they were not.
We reallocated them to their home address. We had a lot of testimony about this, and I don't remember exactly, but usually incarcerated people, men, spend time, I think the average is anywhere from 24 to 36 months, and for women, I think it's 18 months. So it's not a 10-year cycle. And when we were in the Eastern Plains, and I had no idea that we actually have a rural development program. It's called Building Prisons in rural areas. So I think there was a fear in the Eastern Plains that if they were reallocated, that they would lose their prisons. And it was, there was no change to the prisons, no change to the employees, no change to, any of the funding that they get is really where they were counted. So this was a very, we got a lot of testimony about this. And so I think I can't remember what the full vote was, but I think we were 11-1 on the legislative side to reallocate prisoners to their last known home address.
And on the congressional side, I think we split 6-6. And I think we heard the same testimony and had a lot of very much the same debates. I think the split in the end came down to, we get the census data. We might think it's a good thing for prisoner reallocation to adjust the census data. The concern being somebody else might have a different idea of why it would be good to adjust the census data for a different purpose. And so I think that was one of the concerns that led us to a 6-6 split, in which case we needed a supermajority to do that reallocation. And so it failed on the congressional side. And I think it was in part for that, how sacrosanct sacrosanct, whatever the word is, do you want the census data to be, again, so anyway, we did not reallocate prisoners on the
And
congressional side.
I would just add, before that happened, there was a judgment from the Supreme Court because the Colorado State Legislature passed a bill to reallocate prisoners, but because we were deemed independent commissions that the legislature couldn't tell us what to do, then because that passed. I can't remember what the timing was, but that was
it was after amendments Y and Z were passed. Right. So there was some question.
So I'm not sure what will happen 10 years from now, because now the legislature has passed that bill. So my guess is reallocation will be automatic in the next 10 years because now the legislature passed that bill. But I think some of it was the timing and the Supreme Court's decision that the commissions were independent and the legislatures could not tell the commissions what to do on this issue.
And 10 years from now, who knows, the census may count prisoners differently.
Yeah.
Because it's a very contentious issue across the country.
Beyond the census data being delayed, were there concerns with the accuracy of the census, whether it underrepresented certain areas of the state? Did that come into play in the discussion at all for either map?
The biggest issue with this year's census data was the whole concept of differential privacy and the fact that the census, introduced noise into the data to avoid being able to back engineer and identify people explicitly. And I fully expect that there will be lawsuits over that at the national level. That I think that more than, and I think the issue there was nobody really knew how they were going to introduce that noise. And so the fear was that might be noisier, if you will, in less sparsely populated areas. I don't know if that's been borne out or not. But that was, I think, the biggest issue with the census data this year was this, they've always introduced noise to some extent, but it was a completely new process that, they think is foolproof for all time. I think, for all time, there's going to be a lot more technological developments that will probably make that not foolproof, but.
Yeah, and I would just add, Commissioner Shell she spoke very eloquently of, how it impact our map making. So, we just use the census data that we had. We can't change it at all. But I would say, as a person who lives in a county, talking to our county clerk in Routt County, for example, where I am, that our census was 600 people less than 10 years ago. And we know that's not true. But the census is the census. You can only use the numbers that you have. And I think we saw in COVID that a lot of people did not respond. I think in our county and most of the Northwest counties, we got a 50 to 60% response rate. And it's unfortunate that sometimes people either don't really know what the census does. I'll just give you an example, having worked for the county. So if you remember at the beginning of the COVID epidemic, we were all talking about the PPE stockpiles, who had surgical masks and who had the gowns and the gloves and all that kind of, and so there's stockpiles all around the state, and the amount of masks and gloves that you get is based on your census. So all these things that, I don't think regular people know are based on the census data of, there's federal funding for schooling, for libraries, for all these things. And so I wish, just like I wish in voting, one of my closing statement for the commission was like, we did our part. Now the next part is everybody's got to register and vote, because it's really quite, and you guys are dedicated to that. I gave the story of, I was in Berlin when the wall went down, and in 1989, I guess it was, and it was so moving to me, of all these people in East Berlin that were finally free and at some point would be able to participate in the process. And I was also in South Africa after apartheid, where African Americans, or not African Americans, sorry, Black Africans could finally vote in South Africa. And so people stand for lines and lines, and I saw that in the Czech Republic too. And then you look at the United States and we take it for granted. And my mom didn't vote until 1988 because she always felt like, oh, I don't know enough. I can't vote. And so I got so mad at her. And so she would complain about something and I'd say, you cannot complain about anything until you vote. So I think the important part of, people need to vote, but the other thing is people need to participate in the census. And unfortunately during COVID, but also in regular times, I don't think enough people realize what an impact it does for a community, especially I think us on the Western Slope is a lot of funds that, just they go to the Front Range and they don't go to us. And if more people participated in the census, we'd have more resources. That's my soapbox, sorry.
No, I think that's very good to get that information in this program, especially. So you mentioned that the Supreme Court, the justices seem to be having, you didn't say this, I'm paraphrasing, seem to be having some concern on how to deal with differences of opinion. If the Supreme Court just determines the redistricting commission met the criteria, the requirements in delineating the different areas, how does the court then, does the court then need to listen to other legal challenges, or can they say, if there's no agreement that can be reached through the different legal challenges, does the court have to ultimately make the decision?
Well, they either certify the map, in which case is basically their not really their approval, but their statement that we met all the constitutional requirements and did not what's the word I'm looking, abuse our discretion. So it's really, they're not there to approve the map. They're there to determine whether or not the commissions did what they were supposed to do. And, the whole point of the briefs and the oral arguments is for other people to weigh in and try and say, no, we don't believe they did, or yes, we believe they did. And then as judges do, have to weigh the evidence before them and the record for each of the commissions to determine in their opinions whether or not we met our constitutional requirements. And if we didn't in their mind, then they have to explicitly say what we did wrong and give us that 12 days to cure.
Yeah, and we work with a nonpartisan staff to create another map and get more public comment. And then if we send it back to the Supreme Court and they're still not satisfied, then the Supreme Court draws the maps.
Which is exactly how we got to having independent commissions in the first place. So that would be very unfortunate, given all of the time and effort that went into both the congressional and the legislative maps.
Exactly.
Not to mention the money.
Yes.
Yeah, that too. Well, it's 6:30 and I have another work thing I have to do to get to at 6:45. So it's been a pleasure to meet all of you. And I'm sure about Commissioner Shell. I still have my commissioner email and we'll have it until we're signed, sealed, and delivered.
Right. Right.
So if anybody has questions, feel free to email me, or you can email the commissions on the website, the email address, and they can forward questions to us as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was fun having both sides.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So in the interest of ending this webinar like a webinar, thank you so much for participating in this. And we need to thank you and the independent staff who assisted the commission.
Yes.
You all worked so hard and traveled so far and spent many long hours working on these maps. It's how do you pronounce it? It's Herculean, or it's just a huge process. We want to close by encouraging people to visit the redistricting site. There's so much good information there. And it looks like we've lost our one person who is participating. One final pitch, we want people to vote, and you all said that. Check out vote411.org to make sure that you all are registered and ready to vote in the 3 counties, and watch our website for league programs and activities. And the final page of our little doohickey is the next program that we'll be watching in November. And watch the calendar for redistricting and when the Supreme Court makes their decisions. And I just want to again say that this is pretty historical stuff. And it might not be the model for the next 10 years. And who knows if we'll all even be alive by then. But at any rate, thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate the efforts that you've gone through.
Thank you. It was doubly difficult, and I'm sure Commissioner Shepard would agree, you know, having the delay in the census data really threw a wrinkle into the process. So I'm hoping 10 years from now, the census data will be delivered on the 1st of April rather than the 23rd of August or 12th of August, whatever the date was, so that there's more time to focus on map making and less time to focus on process. So.
And I hope the next census isn't as political, and yeah, and we get a good count. Yeah.
Yes.